India has been the constant really since I was 18. I had my 19th birthday in Hampi, sleeping rough in a temple with a sleeping bag and getting up and swimming in the Tungabhadra River that morning. So, and here I am at 60 and I'm going back to Hampi for my birthday next month. So.
Wow.
1857 seems to me one of the very great tragedies of Indian history. By far the bloodiest moment in colonial history. I think, if you ask most people what was the worst atrocity the British did, they'd probably say Jallianwala Bagh. Well, the number of killed in Delhi in August, September 1857 is very probably in the tens of thousands, and massive enslavement of women and kidnapping and rape and horrors beyond number. When you finish a book, there's a terrible process of it's like a divorce, because you've been living with these characters often for 4 or 5 years. It's not a divorce really so much as like leaving college or something, where you've had a whole set of friends where for 3 years have been your mates and all your days have been spent with them, and suddenly they're not there. Then you have the compensation that all these people that you've been living with, suddenly everyone else is talking about them because, and you can share these characters that you've been living with and they become interested by.
William Dalrymple has done something that almost nobody in the English-speaking world has done. He took the story of India, not the Raj version, not the textbook version, not the colonial apology, and made the world pay attention. He's a Scot who's discovered he's part Bengali, a great-great-grandnephew of Virginia Woolf, a man who arrived in India at 18 because Saddam Hussein shut down his dig in Iraq. He co-founded the Jaipur Literature Festival. He won the Wolfston Prize, the Duff Cooper Prize, a CBE, a BAFTA, and was named one of the world's top 50 thinkers. His books, The Anarchy and White Mughals, are being turned into major productions, and his latest, The Golden Road, makes the case that before the Silk Road, there was India's road, and it carried the ideas that built the modern world. He once told an interviewer, "The true story of India is so extraordinary, you don't need to make anything up." Let's find out why. William Dalrymple, let's go. Welcome to Expressions. Today I'm joined by someone very wonderful who needs no introduction, but let me introduce him to you. He's Mr. William Dalrymple, author, historian. I'm truly honored to have you on
Thank
my
you,
podcast.
Neha. Very sweet of you to come over here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So everyone talks about the pollution in Delhi, yet you haven't fled to Shimla or Goa. How would you explain your deep-rooted attachment to the city?
I love this city.
Yeah.
And I have to say, today is one of the great days of the Delhi year. It's had this perfect, warm sun,
Yeah.
lovely breezes. The pollution's lower than it's been for about 5 months.
Yeah.
And we're all remembering why we love this city. There's
Yeah.
the noise of peacocks and minor birds
Yeah.
chattering
Yeah.
and parrots in the trees. And I can't think of anywhere I'd rather live today, I have to say.
Nice. So
that said, the city has got a major pollution problem.
Yeah.
And it's very sad that the government don't seem to be taking it seriously. They've actually cut their budget for pollution control. And this is a big problem because you can have growth without pollution. It's possible. And the Chinese have sorted this out. Beijing was in a very bad way 20 years ago, and now it's got very, very good air. So this is not something which is impossible to do. It isn't. London too. London in the 19th century was famous for the London smog.
Yeah.
And it took the multiple deaths during a terrible smog episode in the 1930s, I think, for the pollution laws to be really enforced very seriously. And today London has very good air again. So this is something that can be done. It just needs political will. But I know lots of my friends have moved to Goa or to Simla, and it's sad because this should be a city where people enjoy living and can live well and without the worry to their health.
Sure.
It's terrible that foreign embassies now regard this as a hardship posting, like sort of going to Kabul or something. It should not be like that.
True. So growing up in the UK, one assumes Wuthering Heights and Pride and Prejudice were some of the favorite classics for the girls. What about the boys of your generation?
I actually went, although I grew up in Scotland, I was sent to boarding school in Yorkshire, in the North York Moors, and Wuthering Heights was absolutely what, well, had it both as a set text, but I remember being very taken with it because it was set where I was living. Quite often, you read novels that are set in places very far from your experience, and it's kind of make-believe world. It could be science fiction, but Wuthering Heights felt absolutely outside my front door. As a teenager, I've always been mainly a non-fiction reader, and I've always read history and archaeology and art history, which are my three great loves. But as a novel reader in my teens, it was the Russians I loved. I loved Tolstoy. I think War and Peace remains the greatest novel ever written, without a shadow of doubt, followed by Anna Karenina. And I loved the quieter Russian novelists like Turgenev, Chekhov. And I remember when I first came to India, I was also still reading the big Russian 19th century novels. And the plains of North India, were the fields on which War and Peace was taking place in my imagination, and because I'd never seen Great Plains before. I came from hilly country, from Scotland and Yorkshire.
So you arrived in India at 18, almost by accident. If Saddam Hussein hadn't shut down Iraq, and you hadn't boarded that flight, who would William would have become now?
So I've always been interested in history and archaeology, but I wanted to go initially to the Middle East. And I had arranged to go and dig on an Assyrian site. And thank God I didn't, because I'm very glad that I spent my life in India rather than in Iraq, which would have been a very poor choice. I don't know, it's hard to say what I would have become, because India has so very much molded who I am and what I am. I've lived here my entire adult life. And it's been the subject, not of all my books, but most of my books. There's a couple of books one about the Middle East, one about Afghanistan, one about following Marco Polo's journey to China. But otherwise, I suppose 8 other books have all been about India. I think it has profoundly changed who I am and what I believe, and the world I grew up in feels very distant. It's also been, I have to say, a very generous place to me. I've had different careers here at different times. I've been a festival director, a photographer, a foreign correspondent, a travel writer, a teacher at one point initially in Dehradun. And India has accommodated all that. While my careers have changed, and ultimately now obviously I'm a historian, India has been the constant really since I was 18. I had my 19th birthday in Hampi, sleeping rough in a temple with a sleeping bag, and getting up and swimming in the Tungabhadra River that morning. But here I am at 60, and I'm going back to Hampi for my birthday next month. So.
Wow! And you still remember the 19th birthday?
So that whole year, that first year in India, is absolutely set in my memory. There are certain big moments in your life that you never forget. Falling in love, whatever it is, the big moments. And India is that first year, particularly the bit when finally traveling and giving up the teaching and going off and visiting Agra and Gwalior and Sanchi and Khajuraho and Ellora and Ajanta for the first time on a budget of 35 rupees a day, which is all we had. And we somehow managed, in those days you could get, you could pay for a cheap night in the hotel and a thali and a packet of glucose biscuits for lunch and a banana.
So India once exported mathematics, astronomy, religion, philosophy to the world. When and why did it stop believing in its own intellectual centrality?
I don't know if India's ever stopped believing in itself, because I think it's still quite a self-confident country, oddly, despite everything. Indians are proud to be Indian. They're not ashamed in any way, and they're well aware of what their country has given the world. The way that it's expressed is not necessarily 100% factual. You find old uncles talking about, the rishis inventing the internet in the time of the Mahabharata, or the Kurukshetra being nuclear bombs, or whatever it was. But I think Indians are very aware of the greatness of their civilization. And one of the pleasures of writing The Golden Road, my most recent book, was in a sense to give firm factual moorings to people's pride. They knew that they wanted to be proud about it, but often they weren't quite sure what to be proud about. And that book has been by far my most successful in this country. It was #1 for 35 weeks without a break. And it's lovely when you can research something that really interests you and people want to hear it. You know, often writers are the bringers of bad news in one way or another, and they're the messengers of, you know, if there's massive human rights abuse or something's gone wrong in politics. But in this occasion, it was possible to write a paean of praise to India's civilization that made everyone happy.
So you've traveled and written extensively about West Asia. Why does that region fascinate you? And is there any, is there any favorite memory of a particular city?
So, my patch, as far as my book's concerned, I consider to be sort of, I suppose, from Greece through to Calcutta, maybe. And I've always been fascinated by West Asia, or the Middle East, as I grew up calling it.
Yeah.
It's a far more troubled region than here. I think, despite everything, India is ultimately a happy place. If you look at Indian movies, it's always, you know, couples dancing around the garden. And it is a place which, despite poverty, despite all the problems we all know every day, the Delhi traffic jam and the pollution and everything else, it is, I feel, ultimately a place that is happy in its own skin.
Yeah.
That's emphatically not the case in places like Palestine, where there are great unresolved tragedies. And my next book is actually going to be a history of the Palestinians, I think, in some form or other. It's which is a book that will get me in as much trouble as the Golden Road got me. In a sense, again, that's, you know, it's good to mix the easy truth telling with the difficult.
Yeah. So when is that going to be coming out?
I'm only really beginning it now, but I've got so upset about Gaza and the way it's been reported and the misinformation about the region. Like India, that region was profoundly its natural trajectory was profoundly disjointed by colonialism. And in my study of the British Empire, which has really been my main subject for the last 25 years, in India, mainly the East India Company, but more recently in my podcast, Empire, to deal with British colonialism as a whole, you become aware of how cavalier the decisions often were, that hugely important decisions would spin on a single whim of a single ill-informed person. And no example is better than that than the Balfour Declaration, where, you know, merrily the British gave away a country that wasn't theirs to give away. And at the time of the Balfour Declaration, Palestine was 96% Muslim and Christian. And I don't think Lord Balfour or any of the cabinet knew that. They grew up with the Bible and had very clear ideas about the Jewish past in Palestine. They didn't know the reality of the present, which was a country which was, in different estimates, between 94 and 96% Christian and Muslim, and in 1917 only about 6% Jewish population. And that was, by 1948, turned up to 30%, and then the Nakba took place, and 85% of the Palestinians were expelled. So it's a very tragic story. The liberation of one people was the damning of another. And until both find a way to coexist, we're never going to see this problem.
So did you spend time a lot there? And
I have, and my favorite of my travel books is From the Holy Mountain, which was the one period of my life I lived away from India. In the mid-1990s, I was based in the Middle East, writing particularly about the Christian communities, because, of course, Christianity was an Eastern religion. It was born in Jerusalem and spread out initially to Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, these great cities. And in the mid-1990s, I spent a lot of time walking around the Middle East, all the way from Greece through Turkey, through Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Egypt, and wrote this book, From the Holy Mountain, that I think is probably my best travel book before I started writing history books, the one I'm most proud of. And so this is my first book about that region for 20 years. So,
And how do you get people to tell their dark stories? I mean, how do you build that trust?
I mean, not everyone does. You
Yeah.
know, obviously, every journalist knows the situation where you
Yeah.
ask for an interview and you're not given one.
Yeah.
I'm sure even you've had this. But you know, you talk to people and establish a contact, and hopefully the stories will come. I mean,
Okay.
many interviews don't work out,
Yeah.
obviously.
So you've you've written about declining empires from Rome to the Mughals. What early warning signs of civilizational decline do most societies often miss?
Well, it's interesting. I'm literally doing, in my podcast at the moment, I do this Empire podcast,
Yeah.
which has totally transformed my life, actually, I have to say.
In what way?
It's been an astonishing thing. Normally, if you write a book, I spend 5 years on these big fat history books, and you know, if you're lucky, you might sell 100,000 paperbacks. If you're really lucky, you might sell 100,000, maybe 150 over 5-6 years. This podcast is a completely different order of, and it's totally global. So you put it out there, and in 2 years, we're about to cross 90 million downloads. 90 million, which is just astonishing. So you have a listenership, or your message goes out to far more people than any way.
And it's there forever on the internet.
And it's there for everyone on the internet. So it's quite a lot of hard work. And we do 2 episodes a week, and they involve research. We don't have researchers. So I'm finding a lot of my life is now eaten up by the podcast, but it's well worth it. In the podcast this week, we're dealing with something called the Bronze Age collapse, which is a fascinating moment because at the end of the Bronze Age, which is about 2000 BCE, just as the Indus Valley is coming to a close, there is this very international web of trade connections. From here, the Indus Valley traders are traveling to the Middle East. Afghanistan is exporting lapis, which is reaching all these cities like Ur of the Chaldees and so on. But in the Mediterranean, you have a web of contacts with all these merchant cities down the eastern coast, particularly Ugarit in what's now Syria, the Hittites in what's now Turkey, Mycenae in what's now Greece, Troy between them, and ancient Egypt as the big kid on the block and the most powerful, and then not minor, but lesser powers in that region like Babylon and Syria.
Sure.
That whole world collapses in about 15 years for reasons which this podcast analyzes this week. There's a 6-part series, which has been fascinating. And it's connected with climate change, dramatic climate change. It's connected with over-interdependence on international trade and what happens when supply chains break down. And these civilizations go down like dominoes, and there's absolutely no indication that they know that they're on the edge of a major civilizational collapse. So it's a very interesting story. I've had great fun translating. I mean, I've had great fun recording it, and we've had a mixture of academic guests, such as wonderful Professor Joe Quinn at Cambridge, who's the professor of ancient history. But we also had Stephen Fry, who I think Indians probably best know as Jeeves and Wooster or Blackadder, who is a great expert and a great enthusiast for ancient Greek civilization. So we cornered him when he came to Jaipur and recorded him.
Nice.
Incidentally, the YouTube that we put out with his things have gone
viral?
Absolutely viral because he's got such an incredible following.
Yes, absolutely. So, do historians secretly fall in love with their subjects? When you're writing books like The Last Mughal, Anarchy, do you ever find yourself emotionally attached to these subjects, even if they're morally complicated?
Yes, you do.
Yeah.
And you live in that world in an extraordinary extent. And when you finish a book, there's a terrible process of it's like a divorce, because you've been living with these characters often for 4 or 5 years. It's not a divorce really so much as like leaving college or something, where you've been you've had a whole set of friends where for 3 years have been your mates, and all your days have been spent with them, and suddenly they're not there. Then you have the compensation that all these people that you've been living with, in a sense, alone, because they're in your head, because you've been reading the manuscripts and the letters and so on. Suddenly everyone else is talking about them because, you know, and you can share
Yeah.
these characters that you've
Yeah.
been living with and become interested by.
Yeah. So
But you do, and I think, well, obviously there's many different ways to write history, and there's many different forms of history book. But the sort of books I write, which are narrative driven and biographically driven, it's definitely important to be, if not in love with your subjects, at least passionately involved, because otherwise you get, you know, for 5 years you're living with these people, you get bored of them. It dies, and you can always tell when you're reading a book if the author's got bored. You know when he's sick of it, and he makes you sick of it too. So only if you're really enthused and alive to a subject can it really leap off the page, I think.
Absolutely, I agree with you. So in White Mughals, you described a world where British officials wore Indian clothes, married into Indian family, and moved between cultures with ease. Do you believe that the culture permeability has disappeared, or was it never really deeply entrenched?
No, I think obviously cultures intermingle more than ever these days, and you know, when you go to Britain or the US to see all the Indians who've married out, and now it's a cliche, you know, the Indian daughter-in-law or whatever it is. It's very, very common, and that's a good thing. But it has a history, and I think often people assume that cultures were like sort of sealed Tupperware boxes of Indianness and Britishness, and that's not true. In all generations, love and relationships have upended safe, easy expectations of parents and employers and so on.
So you know Indian culture very well by now.
Well, it's always full of surprises. I don't think you can ever know Indian culture very well, in the sense that it's so vast and this country is so enormous, and there are so many different facets. And one of the nice things about writing about India is that, you know, at different times I've written about the British in India or the Mughals. Now with Golden Road, I was writing particularly about the early period and the early Buddhist period and the Gupta era and so on. And I'm now 60. I've been writing books of India for 40 years, and I'm still learning massive amounts. And there's whole areas of India and whole areas of Indian history I haven't touched on. So I could go on for nine more lives, I think, and still learn.
Super. So 1857, military defeat or psychological rupture. When Delhi fell in 1857 and Bahadur Shah Zafar was exiled, was it merely the end of a dynasty? What do you feel?
So the two things happened in 1857. One was the actual sort of defeat of that whole Indo-Islamic world, which had been dominant since the 12th century. And the second thing was the way that it was sort of discredited. The scale of the defeat and the absoluteness of the defeat meant that people became ashamed of that culture. And that was, I think, probably true of Hindu courts in India as well as Muslim ones, that colonialism was triumphant. It had won a major military victory, and people began questioning their own culture, and sometimes questioning it in a very positive way. And you get things like, I don't know, Aligarh University and the attempt to modernize. But also you get a loss of confidence in culture. So you get the end of the Indian miniature painting tradition, for example, around this period too. People just want photographs because it's more smart and Western. And an awful lot is lost at that period. A lot of Indian culture just disappears, never to return. So 1857 seems to me one of the very great tragedies of Indian history. And it's by far the bloodiest moment in colonial history. I think, you know, if you ask most people what was the worst atrocity the British did, they'd probably say Jallianwala Bagh. But the number of people killed in Jallianwala Bagh was in the tens and low hundreds, while the number of killed in Delhi in August, September 1857 is very probably in the tens of thousands in a very short period of time. And massive enslavement of women and kidnapping and rape and horrors beyond number. So I think it was a very grim time.
Yes.
But for a writer, a great tragedy like that is a great opportunity to explore a world.
Yeah. I'm curious, when you write about figures like Clive, Bahadur Shah Zafar, you begin with judgment or with empathy?
So you are drawn to a subject often by the characters. I mean, Clive was definitely one of the things that attracted me to write The Anarchy, because he's this complicated, evil character who never loses. He's like Lord Voldemort. He's brilliant on the battlefield. He defeats all his enemies. He then goes back to London, where he defeats his rivals in the East India Company directorship and triumphs in the business, and then becomes an MP and is an extremely successful politician. But his karma comes back to haunt him, and he eventually slits his own wrists and kills himself, and is booed in the streets of London. So characters like that do, yes, draw me into stories. I don't know whether this is true of other historians, but I'm certainly drawn by characters and for better or worse. And I mean, it's wonderful to find a heroine like Heronisa in White Mughals, but it's also wonderful to find a villain like Clive.
I like the way you compare him to Voldemort. So from the British to the Soviets to the Americans, why do empires repeatedly underestimate Afghanistan?
Well, Afghanistan, remember, is also a place that generated empires. Timur and Babur and so on. And before that, the Kushans, who are often forgotten in the writing of Indian history, but were a very important dynasty. These all arrived out of Afghanistan. So I don't think it's entirely true to think of Afghanistan as the graveyard of empires. It's also the cradle of many empires. But it's classic guerrilla territory. They're very warlike people, always have been, and their warlike nature is perhaps generated partly by the landscape, which is so mountainous, and it's an easy place to defend from invaders. And as the East India Company found, it's very expensive to occupy. It's quite cheap to occupy India. If you can conquer Bengal because it's rich and it's flat, and you don't need enormous numbers of troops to maintain order in a flat plain that's full of taxable villages and rich weavers that you can also exploit and loot. But Afghanistan, it's just rocks and men. And so while it's expensive to get materials up there, and while you have to maintain forts at every pass and every mountain range, there's very little profit to be made from it. So it's often that it's just not worth it. And like the Americans very recently, people just throw up their hands and say, this is not worth the effort.
I like the way you explained it. From 9 Lives to The Last Mughal, religion appears as both beauty and rupture. So what first drew you to the tension between faith and power? Does religion inherently become violent, or is it politics that weaponizes it?
I grew up in a very religious household. My parents were what I suppose you'd call Catholic fundamentalists in many ways. I am not very religious. But once you're brought up in a religious household, you can't look at the world in an entirely secular way ever again. The importance of religion is always there. I've often noticed that when I do programs on religion, for example, you often find that the people you're working with, their parents are priests, children, or bishops. Or the same is true here in Hindu and Muslim context, that even though you might not support the faith of a previous generation, the whole set of attitudes which you're brought up into is very hard to shed. And so, yes, religion appears a lot in my books, though it doesn't appear quite so much in my own personal life. But it's always fascinated me what people believe. And 9 Lives is a look particularly at the stranger manifestations of faith in India, like Devdasis or Tibetan monks who take up arms to defend the Dalai Lama, or tantric figures in Tarapit in Bengal.
Does religion inherently become violent, or it's politics that weaponizes it?
Religion teaches you that there is a higher truth that is greater than this world, and therefore, if you accept that truth, that it's something that is very important to you and should be defended. And so when rival faiths come together, you can get balance. Though India, I would say, is, for all the troubles, and despite history of intermittent violence between religions, nonetheless, India seems to me a brilliant example of a country where many faiths live together by and large peacefully.
Yeah, yeah.
And even Indian history, for all the well-known massacres and horrors that have taken place because of religion in this country, by and large, different communities have lived side by side for most of the time in peace.
Yeah, that's a very positive way of looking at it. After researching the Kohinoor and your other books, who do you believe owns history? The civilization that created it, the empire that took it, or the global audience that now consumes it?
I don't think anyone owns history. History is there to be researched and understood. Because I studied the East India Company doesn't mean I own the East India Company or its legacy. I will attempt to understand it, but someone else will come after me and take my insights beyond and prove where I've got things wrong. It's the inevitable fate of a historian that the next generation will correct whatever you've done. But there are lessons to be learned from it. And I do believe that if you don't know history, you can't understand this world properly. That it's as important to understand history as it is to understand science or mathematics, that in different ways it helps us understand the world around us. And to be in a place and not know its history is like being in a place without a map. You can't locate yourself on the map, and therefore you can't find the relationship of where you are to what has come before and after.
Nice. So you've chronicled the fall of the Mughals and the rise of the East India Company. When you look at today's geopolitical landscape, do you see the symptoms of other empire in transition?
Well, I think there is a major long-term move that we are seeing in India today, which is the reversion to the world before colonialism, a world where India and China, between them, generated 80% of the world's GDP. That was true for most of human history. India and China, by which I mean the wider, greater India region, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and China with its attendant civilizational outposts, were the richest and most productive parts of the world for most of human history. That prosperity was heavily punctured by the colonial period, beginning in 1492, whatever, with Columbus going to America, but also Vasco da Gama coming here a few years later, landing in Calicut, and immediately shelling it. And for the period between 1500 and 1947, wealth flowed from India to the West. In a way that for the rest of human history, it flowed from the West to India. Now we're beginning to see that. It's taken 75 years since the end of the colonial period, but now that natural equilibrium of the world is being rebalanced. And so I do not see the rise of India or the rise of China as something strange and inexplicable. It seems to me an inevitable truth of the way the world is that got put out of joint by the freak of European military development in the 15th, 16th, and 18th centuries. And then the looting and the asset stripping that followed it. But India got rid of the British in 47, 75 years have passed, and you're well on your way to, well, you just overtook Japan and about to overtake Germany, and you will be one of the top 3 economic powers within the decade.
You worked in dusty archives, royal manuscript collections across Asia. What is the most extraordinary historical artifact that you've ever held in your hand?
I mean, just speaking personally, the major moment of discovery, which shouldn't have been a major moment of discovery because it's not at all surprising it was there, but to sit in the Indian National Archives and in the middle of a break while researching White Mughals to come across the catalogue that was called, on the spine, the Mutiny Papers. Now, I knew enough about Indian history to know that there was not meant to be an archive of the rebels' documents. People always said you have to write 1857 through the British sources, read it against the grain, but those are the only sources available. Yet it turns out that in the National Archives, in the most obvious place you could possibly look, was this enormous treasure trove of documents, of whatever it is, like 30,000 documents or something, from the rebel camp and the Red Fort, which had been collected by the British as evidence for the prosecution of the people, unfortunate people who got hung and imprisoned and exiled. But because it was written in quite difficult scribal Urdu, no one had really used them. And with my wonderful colleagues, Bruce Swinnell and Mahmood Farooqi, we worked through all that. And that is what every historian dreams of finding, the big archive that will change the way people look at things.
In an age of social media and WhatsApp history, what is the role of a serious historian? And are you correcting myths or building better stories now?
So there are many different ways of being a historian. And just like, there are many ways of being a novelist, and there are different levels of novel writing. I write a particular type of history, which is biographically and narrative driven. And while it uses academic techniques, it's not aimed exclusively at academics. It's meant to be read by the general public. So for the type of work that I do, I'm looking both for a period that I think has been misunderstood, but also one that does contain a terrific story which will interest people. I don't want to write a book which will only be read by 10 people. And I mean because I have lived by my writing for most of my career.
But how do we adapt it to this fast-moving WhatsApp and social media?
So Indian history is full of the most incredible stories and most incredible personalities and unbelievable stories. So it's not difficult to find incredible tales, whether it's the rise of Vijayanagara, the Gupta Golden Age, the period of the Cholas, Akbar's multi-faith discussions, or the evil doings of Lord Clive, whatever it is. These are extraordinary stories to tell. And I naturally reach for these stories. It's what really interests me. When I go on holiday, I don't tend to read a novel. I will read a history book of something which I'm longing to know about. At the moment, it's West Asian history, and I'm reading all about the Nakba and early the rise of the Philistines and the Israelites and the Ottomans and the Crusaders, and for the next 3 or 4 years, that'll be what I will be reading for pleasure as well as for work. And I think if these subjects are alive for you, you can communicate that to readers.
And what is the single most dangerous historical myth currently shaping India's imagination?
I think India has a complicated historiography, obviously, over the deep wound of Hindu-Muslim relations in this country. And in the Nehruvian period, people tended to gloss over some of the violence done in the past. And today, I think the opposite is true, that all that anyone knows about the Middle Ages and the Mughal period is violence, temple destruction, and everything. So we've gone from one extreme to another. I think it's a hugely damaging myth that the two communities have always been daggers drawn and always at war. It's simply not true. That there are many, many examples in history of civilizations built here on coexistence, and the two communities have by and large got on together. But if you look on Twitter or anything, you get the impression that there's an unending sequence of violence and bloodshed throughout the whole of history. History is more complicated than that. And I have to say, I think more optimistic in my view. But,
So if you were India's foreign minister, how would you negotiate the new order with US and China?
If I was the foreign minister of any country, I have no idea how I would negotiate with America in any way at all, because Trump seems to change his views from one day to the next.
I can agree with you more.
I mean, the Modi, the story, the saga of the relationship of Modi and Trump, which everyone thought was going to go one direction and went a completely different direction, and now is beginning perhaps to edge back again, is the same as the relationship of Trump to Zelensky, where he's oscillated 6 or 7 times. It's like living with it's like a mad king from a fairy tale or something. It's completely unpredictable. So I have no idea what poor Jaishankar will have to do in order to. I think he's keeping a steady hand on the tiller in very, very choppy seas, and it does look as if the tariffs are now going to go down, and that period of very worrying U.S.-Indian tailspin seems to be probably over for the time being.
Okay. So how do you and Namita keep the JLF programming fresh with so many repeated authors? And what were
It's very easy. There's so many new writers coming up every year. I never invite any author again until they've got a new book out. So even my favorite authors are not allowed to come 2 years running unless they've got a new book that's come out. But beyond that rule, we don't represent any government agency or any cultural institution, and we are entirely free to invite exactly who we like on a whim, really, which is one of the great pleasures, which means that we both, Namita and I, invite authors we love and authors we admire, and we don't have it. We have, I mean, to a certain extent, there are various people that have to be kept happy, but in general, 90% of our list, if not 95% of our list, is simply the authors we admire and who we'd like to hear this year. We have no obligation to anyone. We have no boxes to tick, and I think the festival reflects that joy in literature, that people go there because they know that they're going to hear really interesting talks, and that they will be varied and different. And Namita always tries to commission at least 20 different Indian languages in every edition. I try to keep my list as international as possible, with authors from China and Japan and Latin America and the Arab world, particularly at the moment with Gaza and all the trouble there.
The energy there is always...
The energy there is fantastic. And people, that's why people come back. And that's why it's still the biggest and best literary festival in the world. And Jaipur is unbelievably good setting for a literary festival. We were our 2 lucky breaks at the beginning were which was entirely inherited from our mother festival, which was the Jaipur Virasat Festival, founded by John and Faith Singh. Just before we started, and we inherited the fact that it was in January and that it was in Jaipur, and those 2 facts, that it's just that beautiful Jaipur weather in January, just when winter's beginning to warm up, and that Jaipur is a town with spectacular transport links, both in domestic and international. I mean, Etihad flies there from the Middle East, plus delicious hotels from every budget, from 1,000 cheap hostels through to Rambagh and the Leela, and it's just one of those things that's worked. And we had, I think, nearly 500,000 people this year, 400,000 plus.
Fantastic. So after spending decades studying war, empire, violence, civilization, are you fundamentally optimistic or pessimistic about the world we're living in just now?
That's I've also studied dance, music, literature, song, painting, sculpture, love poetry, and so yes, I'm ultimately optimistic. I think we're in a very strange place politically at the moment. Particularly, it's impossible to know what America's going to do the second half of one day, never mind in the long term. But I'm particularly optimistic about India. In the 40 years I've been living here, India has changed irrevocably, but usually for the better, with the exception of pollution and the environment. It feels in a very good place. I love living here. I mean, I'm just today sitting on my charpoy upstairs, listening to the birds, and in this perfect Delhi February weather. There's no other place I'd rather be. No.
Absolutely. Last question. Who are you when no one is looking?
I think probably the same person as I am when people are looking. I have always lived life. I've been lucky enough to do as my work what I would do anyway if I won the lottery and didn't have to work ever again. And the life we built, my family and I, between here and escaping during the monsoon to London, and Olivia's painting and Sam's books and my other kids' work in London, we've been very lucky. Touch wood, things have worked out.
Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
It was just such a fabulous session and I really enjoyed myself.
Thank you, Neha. Thank you so much.
That was William Dalrymple. If you're not already a fan, you are now. The Golden Road is in bookstores everywhere. The Empire podcast is a must listen. And if this episode lit something in you, if it made you want to read, to travel, to dig into the history beneath your feet, pass it on, share it. That's all we ask. Because the best stories aren't the ones that get told the most. They're the ones that were hiding in plain sight all along. See you next week.